Good evening, guys. How are you doing today? I want to make a quick video today, hoping that it can be shared because what I'm about to say is very critical and important. Now, we are living in an age where colonialism is beginning to take place again on the continent. A lot of people want to call this period that we're living in colonialism 2.0. But I'd like to say that it hasn't just begun today. China, the one that everybody is treating as a threat, is not the threat that we have in Africa, but the threat that we've got in Africa is actually the same old colonial powers that we had before, who have got new and better instruments to utilize to subjugate our continent. So, in as much as China has got the ability to give loans, the ability to give money, the ability to bring a whole lot of money, trade, and open markets for Africans, the Europeans, the Americans, and the colonial powers or imperial powers still utilize force, the stick, much more than they utilize the carrot. And this is why when a lot of people talk about China being a threat to Africa, I don't join in those conversations because China has never threatened any country or any people for those people to trade. Secondly, China has been trading with African countries for over 600 years, and at no point did they colonize a single African country. Now get me right, I'm not saying that the deals that are being signed are not problematic. I'm not saying that the deals that are being signed cannot cause problems tomorrow, but the truth of the matter is that a lot of the deals that China is signing are what you call bilateral deals, in which they don't necessarily give you money, but they produce money to produce a project, and on that project they've got companies that are employed to dispense services that then will allow China to recoup its money. For instance, in Zambia, a lot of people are talking about how Zambia, ZESCO owes this much. That is not true. The fact is that ZESCO has made agreements with power suppliers that are going to supply it with electricity. Those infrastructures that are being developed in partnership between Chinese companies, the Chinese government funding, and the Zambian government. So these are bilateral deals that allow for Zambia to be able to have infrastructure developed, allow the Chinese to be able to collect a tariff, and then there is an amortization of the loan without necessarily putting up any collateral of property that belongs to Zambia. But anyway, that's not my topic. My topic is the issue of sanctions. A lot of Zimbabweans continue to say that sanctions do not matter in Zimbabwe. But right now I'm reading a book that has been released by a man that used to work for the United States Treasury that is talking about how sanctions have become the new weapons, much more effective than hot wars, that the United States is utilizing to achieve its strategic interests, its economic interests, and national security interests. And this brings me to the issue of Zimbabwe. Now, a lot of you Zimbabweans know the Zidera 2001 sanctions. And you know them by name, but a majority of you do not know how these sanctions work. The majority of you do not know how these sanctions are being employed and what it is that these sanctions were supposed to achieve. But those are not the sanctions that are of interest to me. The sanctions that are of interest to me are the sanctions that were imposed on Zimbabwe after the Zidera sanctions did not achieve the required or the desired effect by the United States government. Now, Zidera was put in specifically to stop the land program. Zimbabwe had gotten to a point where they could no longer negotiate with their British, American, and European counterparts, who all had promised to give Zimbabwe money for the land reform program. Now, this land reform program was agreed in Lancaster. There was an agreement by the Europeans, the Americans, and the British that they will all contribute money to the Zimbabwean government to buy land in partnership with the Zimbabwean government. The Zimbabwean government had to put up 50% of whatever money they had to pay for land, And then the Americans, the British, and the Europeans said that they would top up the remaining 50% with their own money. The only condition that the Zimbabwean government had was they were supposed to pay for this land in foreign currency. Zimbabwe did it. From 1980 all the way to 1993, 3 million hectares were bought using a man called Sam Geza, and resettlement took place. But when we got to 1990, there was supposed to be a difference of the land reform that was taking place from willing buyer, willing seller, to now a compulsory acquisition of land. The Land Acquisition Act was changed in 1992-93, and it allowed now for compulsory taking of land. The British government, European Union, together with the American government, started giving Zimbabwe a problem with the acquisition of land. They were no longer giving their share of the money. But Zimbabwe was not also pressuring to take land, because they were giving the ANC in South Africa an opportunity to get independence. But in the meantime, there were negotiations happening behind the scenes. The British, the Americans were saying, no, Mugabe, you cannot take land. The way you are valuing the land, the way the new Land Acquisition Act has changed the way that land is valued. You're now using a land commission to value. That's not what we want. We want farmers to be able to name their price and you pay them. And Mugabe said, no, that's not the way that it should happen, because prices of land keep escalating. So there were arguments between the Zimbabwean government and the Europeans, and eventually the Europeans said, let's have a conference. Let's sit in Harare, let's have a conference, let's see if we can get to an agreement. They sat in Harare, they had a conference. The Europeans wanted a renegotiation of the terms of Lancaster, and Mugabe was saying we had an agreement, there's no way we can renegotiate an agreement. So there was what we call an impasse. On this impasse, the Europeans said they're not going to give Mugabe the money that he wanted. Mugabe said, it's fine, I'm going to take land anyway because the land is ours, so I'm going to take land without compensation. To take land without compensation required an amendment to the constitution. So therefore, to amend the constitution, there had to be a referendum in Zimbabwe. So there was a referendum. This referendum was asking Zimbabweans if there can be a change to the constitution so that Zimbabwe could put into the constitution the expropriation of land without compensation. Zimbabweans, under pressure from the CFU, MDC, and a number of other organizations that were being paid by European institutions and governments, basically persuaded Zimbabweans to refuse the referendum. The refusal of the referendum made them feel that the constitution could not be changed. That very same year, 2000, there were elections, parliamentary elections. In those parliamentary elections, MDC was defeated. When MDC was defeated, ZANU-PF decided to use its majority in parliament to go and do a change to the constitution. They went into the constitution, they made changes to the constitution, and they changed the Land Acquisition Act again, or the Land, what is the word? Land Acquisition Act. And they changed it to allow for the expropriation of land without compensation. This was the very first thing that pissed off the Americans. The Americans then decided that it's one thing to change the law, but it's another thing for the land reform to take place. So they decided to put ZIDERA in 2001. The reason they put ZIDERA was to pressure the Zimbabwean government to stop taking land without compensation. Number two, they put it as a safety measure because ZANU-PF won so narrowly and there were presidential elections in 2002. They felt that there was a possibility that if they put sanctions, they would pressure ZANU-PF to the extent that Robert Mugabe might lose because of the narrow margin of the parliamentary elections. 2002 came, Robert Mugabe won. After Robert Mugabe won, this became problematic for the Americans because it meant that ZIDERA had not worked. And when Mugabe won, he did not stop taking land. Instead, he accelerated the taking of land in what was called the fast-track land reform program. Mugabe became an issue for the US government. So this time they decided to augment the sanctions that had been created by Congress, which were called ZIDERA, with a new set of sanctions that were going to be put in by the President of America. So George Bush, in 2003, April or May, he decided to announce a declaration that Zimbabwe had become an unusual and extraordinary threat to the interests of America, the economic interests of America, and the national security interests of America. In this particular declaration, which was called the Executive Order 13288, he stipulated not the Zimbabwean government, but specific members of the Zimbabwean government, specific politicians of the Zimbabwean government, their companies, friends, relatives, and any other companies that had done business with them previously before. But after that, there were two amendments that were made to this EO 13288. Those amendments were made in 2005. And those amendments now started to put in Zimbabwe as being an extraordinary, unusual threat to America. In particular, 13469 is the one that then empowered the American government to declare Zimbabwe itself, its organizations, its companies, as a threat to national security of America. What this did is that this declaration, it is called an emergency national declaration or a national emergency declaration, where a president says as a national emergency that Zimbabwe has become a threat to America. And with that needs to become a response. So responses that were given to the President of America were informed by two acts. One is called the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, and the other one is the National Economic Act. The National Emergency Act. Both these acts use what are called the war and defense mechanisms. They are military or war instruments that give the President of the United States executive powers as the chief of the military to impose war on any other nation. So literally what had happened is that war had been imposed on Zimbabwe utilizing these two acts. Now, the National Emergency Act actually stipulates that the President of the United States can go to war with any nation without necessarily, it empowers him to go to war with any nation without declaring war. So he can go to war, he can put soldiers on the ground, he can cause havoc, he can put economic instruments like the ones that have been put on Zimbabwe utilizing EO 32469, and he can utilize those to destroy the Zimbabwean economy and even potentially put troops onto the Zimbabwean soil without necessarily declaring it in Congress, but just giving a report to Congress after 3 months. So this is why those of us are saying, you are at war. They utilized defense and war mechanisms to institute sanctions on Zimbabwe, to institute the same sanctions on Zimbabwe that were on Libya, that are on Syria today, that are on North Korea, that are in Iran, that are on any other country that the United States is at war with. But let me tell you why these become so powerful. Because Zidera was just there to control Zimbabwe's ability to get loans from the IMF and in multilateral lending institutions, to refuse Zimbabwe the right to get debt cancellation, to refuse Zimbabwe the obligations of development loans that have been put aside for it. What these do, the ones that George Bush put, is that they stop Zimbabwe from trading internationally with anyone. Initially, they were targeted at these so-called politicians who were destabilizing Zimbabwe and were affecting democracy. But the moment that Zimbabwe was put in and its companies were put in and its organizations were put in, they gave extra powers to the President of the United States at his discretion to order what we call an investigation, to order a stoppage, a blockage, a limitation, a prohibition, a blockage, the sale of any other activity. He can stop activities of any company that is deemed to be associated with the Zimbabwean government, any company that is deemed to have done business with the Zimbabwean government, any company that is deemed to have been associated or linked with the Zimbabwean government, the politicians that have been stipulated, their companies, their friends' companies, or companies that have done business with them. What this is tantamount to is that any company in the world, any organization in the world can potentially be targeted by the US president as having contravened sanctions against Zimbabwe for doing business in Zimbabwe, doing business with a company in Zimbabwe, doing business with a company that's associated or linked with the government of Zimbabwe. It's such a broad brush. And not only is it a broad brush, but it's at the discretion of the US president to determine what is legal business and illegal business with Zimbabwe. Another thing is that any payments that have to be made to Zimbabwe utilizing the American currency, utilizing the American payment system, can be blocked by the US president. What this has done is that it makes anybody that wants to do business with Zimbabwe afraid of the risks. Any organization, company, or investment company wanting to invest in Zimbabwe fears immediately the potential risk of contravening or being identified as a contravener of the sanctions that have been imposed on Zimbabwe. And it doesn't only affect US companies. It affects any company in the world that could potentially want to do business in the US, or any company in the world that could potentially need a payment or transfer system from a US bank or through the US financial system. This means that a broad brush has been utilized to threaten any company in the world that wants to do business in Zimbabwe or with a Zimbabwean company, because easily that company can contravene or be deemed to have contravened the laws of the United States. And these laws are administered by what is called the Office of the Financial Assets Control, which sits in the US Treasury. And that is a department that most people do not want to mess with. And that's why we are saying you are under warfare, because you've got a total embargo at the discretion of the US president. And how the US president can mechanize or can act upon any company or any country that trades with Zimbabwe is by mere fact of either a legal instrument or an announcement that he makes on his own. He can make an announcement, he can issue a directive that says that he's going to investigate a company, or that he's going to stop a transaction, or that he's going to sell the assets of a company, or he's going to confiscate the assets of a company that wants to do or has done or will do business with Zimbabwe. And this is why it's important for you guys to understand the sophisticated nature of the sanctions that are on Zimbabwe. The Zidera sanctions are one thing, and the fact that everybody keeps talking about Zidera sanctions, yet in reality, we've got the EO, or what we call Executive Order 13469, that is affecting Zimbabwe much more and contributing to the destruction of the economy of Zimbabwe much more. That is where the problem is. So there are those of you who are ignorant, who say, no, sanctions are not the problem. You need to understand that Iraq doesn't exist today because of similar sanctions to what's on Zimbabwe. Libya doesn't exist today because of similar sanctions that are on Zimbabwe. Syria today is under war because of similar sanctions that are on Zimbabwe. North Korea, for those of you who say it's doing well because it's got nuclear weapons, it's a country where people don't actually have life. It is struggling because of these similar sanctions that are on Zimbabwe. The sanctions that are on Zimbabwe are warfare. There is no extra steps to take for the United States to put its troops on Zimbabwean ground. We are already in a situation in which the US president can have troops on Zimbabwean ground without any extra mechanisms or processes, because we're already in a state of warfare, or we're already a national emergency of the United States government. I hope you start reading on some of these things, because these instruments that are being utilized are the instruments that are going to be utilized going forward as this scramble for Africa, a fight and a tug of war between the Chinese, the Americans, and the Europeans is taking place. Zidera has now included all the European powers, Canada and Australia, as part of Zidera. And you will understand that with the executive powers of the US president, it is assumed that these very same countries are also involved in the executive order of 13469. You've got to understand this. The more unsophisticated we are, the more country bumpkin-like we are, the more uneducated we are about these kind of issues and subjects, the more we're going to be penalized, destroyed by them without knowing. I know it's difficult because even the Iranians themselves, who are the most educated people in terms of PhDs, struggle to understand these sanctions. But that's why there are people like me who, with the little understanding that we have, we try to give it out in simple terms so that we can all start reading some more, feed each other, and try to get an understanding or a better understanding of what exactly is going on. Thank you very much. I hope you will read on these sanctions. I hope you start understanding that it is not Zidera sanctions that are on Zimbabwe. It's not targeted sanctions on politicians that are on Zimbabwe. It is sanctions targeted at any trade, any payment, any economic activity that Zimbabwe is involved in. And those sanctions, the ones that MDC supports, are destroying your nation, its infrastructure, its ability to develop, its opportunities, its future, its banking system. Every asset and facet of Zimbabwe is being destroyed by these sanctions. And a lot of you would ask, so why doesn't ZANU-PF just cooperate? It's very difficult for ZANU-PF to cooperate with these sanctions because they lied to you that Zimbabwe is being sanctioned because of human rights violations. But how are human rights violations in Zimbabwe a threat to the United States security? How are they an extraordinary and unusual threat on the United States, its national interest, its economic interests? How is it that the United States will punish Zimbabwe, all right, by stopping it from trading, stopping it from generating income, stopping it from developing itself by international trade, while trying to stop human rights violations? The truth of the matter is that the sanctions themselves are a human rights violation. The sanctions themselves are part and parcel of why you're seeing cholera in Zimbabwe, because a lot of companies that have pharmaceuticals will not trade with Zimbabwe. So whatever Zimbabwe has or needs has to be sold at double or 3 times the price because we can't go directly to the suppliers, a lot of which are European, a lot of which are American, that are not allowed to trade with Zimbabwe. Payments that will be made to them will be blocked. Payments that need to come for Zimbabwean resources and so forth will also be blocked. This is how sophisticated this thing is. And when you read this book that I'm telling you about that talks about the new warfare or the treasury's war, as it is called, they talk about how these instruments and these new weapons are being utilized and they are more effective than hot war. They are more effective than bombs. But this is not the first time they're used. For Japan to have gotten into the Second World War, part of why Japan got into the Second World War is because they were being isolated by the Americans. Their oil, their fuel, their jet fuel, and food items and steel were being blocked by the United States of America. Eventually, Japan got into a point in 1942 where they said, we would rather go to war, fight with bombs, and get a winner rather than to continue to be killed by a silent warfare that is economic. I hope you understand what I'm talking about. And when I speak to you guys, my objective is to get us to open our minds and to start reading. To open our minds is to start trying to get informed rather than to speak about things from what we hear on social media. Our ignorance on these issues are the reason why it's so easy for us to be attacked and end up fighting each other, end up divided according to ZANU-PF and MDC, and yet we are countrymen from one country who are being attacked by the same enemy while we are busy fighting each other. I hope you understand. Thank you.